Sometimes the smallest of actions can lead us down paths we never imagined. A simple delivery, a routine stop. But for James, that one decision would cost him more than just a few minutes of his time. It would cost him his very sense of reality. He never expected a call for pizza to unravel a nightmare he couldn't escape. But as he stepped into Mrs. Gray's house that evening, he unknowingly stepped into a world of darkness, a place where trust was shattered, and nothing was as it seemed. This is not just the story of a delivery gone wrong. It's the story of a man who learned too late that some doors should never be opened. It was a late afternoon, the kind of quiet evening that hung in the air with the scent of pine and fresh grass. James, a pizza delivery driver, was finishing up the last few orders of his shift, looking forward to heading home and unwinding with a cold drink. He had delivered to the same houses for months now, so the routine was familiar. Routine, though comforting, could also be predictable. A small part of him wished for something new, something different, something that would shake up the monotony of his workday. Little did he know, today would offer him exactly that. It had been a slow night, and his phone buzzed with the next order. He glanced down at the screen, expecting it to be the usual quick, small delivery. But the address on the order caught his attention. It was a little off the beaten path, down a quiet cul-de-sac near the edge of town. He'd delivered there before, but only once or twice, and always to the same house, the home of an elderly woman named Mrs. Gray. She lived alone, so the order usually consisted of just a simple pizza, sometimes a salad. Not much of a talker, she rarely opened the door all the way, and she paid promptly, tipping just enough to make James appreciate the job, but not enough to make him think twice about the quiet visits. James glanced at the details of the order, but something was different this time. The pizza she'd ordered was large, way larger than usual. There were 2 sides of garlic bread, extra wings, and a large drink. A meal that could easily feed 2, if not more. It was curious. Mrs. Gray lived alone, and from the few times James had interacted with her, she didn't seem like the kind of person who would entertain guests often. In fact, her house always seemed too still, too quiet. Maybe she's having family over tonight, James mused to himself, giving the phone a second glance. It was possible, but something about it still didn't sit right. The order wasn't a mistake. It had gone through perfectly, paid for in advance with no issues. Shrugging it off, he grabbed the large pizza box, securing it in the back of his car, and revved the engine. The evening had already begun to cool, and as he drove through the winding streets toward the outskirts of town, the thought of a warm pizza sitting in his car made him grateful for the small comforts in life. The further James drove, the quieter the surroundings seemed to become. The houses became spaced farther apart, and the street lights flickered on, casting long, stretching shadows across the pavement. When he arrived at Mrs. Gray's house, it stood at the very end of the cul-de-sac, tucked in the corner where the street met the trees. It was an old home, the kind that seemed to carry memories with each creaky floorboard, a house that looked like it belonged to a different time. There were no lights on inside. The house was dark, almost eerily so. The wind picked up slightly, rustling the leaves in the yard, and for a moment James felt a chill run down his spine, a feeling he couldn't explain. It was almost as if the house was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He shook the feeling off, but something about the place made him uneasy. James approached the front door, the small porch light flickering weakly above. He rang the bell and waited. A few moments passed, then the door creaked open just slightly, just enough to see Mrs. Gray's frail face peeking through the crack. Her eyes, wide and alert, scanned him briefly before looking down at the pizza box in his hands. "Good evening, ma'am," James said with a warm smile, trying to break the tension he felt in the air. "I've got your order here." Mrs. Gray's eyes darted nervously from the pizza to James's face. Her hands, thin and trembling, gripped the door frame as if she was unsure whether to let him in. James noticed her hesitation, the unease in her posture. Something wasn't right. He had seen a lot of different customers in his time, but there was something about her behavior that made him pause. "Thank you," she said in a soft, almost raspy voice. She quickly reached for the pizza box, but didn't open the door any wider. That's all I need. You can leave now, please." James furrowed his brow, his instincts kicking in. Mrs. Gray's voice trembled, and she seemed almost afraid. He didn't want to be rude, but something didn't feel right. He'd delivered hundreds of pizzas, but in his gut, something told him to linger just a moment longer. "Are you sure everything's okay, Mrs. Gray?" James asked, his voice gentle. "I don't mind staying for a minute, just to make sure you're all right." Her grip on the door tightened, and for the briefest of moments, James caught a flicker of something in her eyes, something like fear, or maybe guilt. It was gone as quickly as it had appeared, but it left a lingering sense of doubt. Mrs. Gray stiffened, her lips pressing together in a thin line. I'm fine, dear. Please go now." But James couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. He felt the pull of curiosity. Something was off, and he couldn't just walk away. His eyes flicked toward the darkened windows of the house, then back to Mrs. Gray's pale face. The silence between them grew thicker, the evening air heavier. As he turned to leave, he heard something, faint at first, like the sound of something dragging across the floor. It was coming from inside the house. James paused mid-step, his heart racing. The sound was faint but distinct, like a shuffle, a dragging, a scuffling noise. It was strange, unsettling, and it made the hair on the back of his neck stand up. James looked back at Mrs. Gray, who had now stepped back into the shadows of the doorway, her figure almost disappearing into the darkness. She wasn't looking at him anymore. She was looking down at the floor, her eyes wide, her expression unreadable. "Ma'am," James called softly, his voice full of concern. What was that sound? Mrs. Gray froze, her face paling as she turned her head toward the interior of the house. Her breath quickened, and she whispered, almost too quietly for him to hear. "Nothing. It's nothing. Just leave." But James couldn't shake the feeling that something, or someone, was inside that house. He had delivered pizzas to strange places before, but this felt different. Something was wrong. Something more than just an odd delivery request. James stood at the threshold, his hand still on the pizza box, his body frozen in place. The door to Mrs. Gray's house was barely open, the dim light from the porch casting a faint glow over her frail figure. But, despite the brightness outside, something about the interior of the house felt like it belonged to another world, one where time stood still, where nothing moved, and where silence hung so thick in the air it almost felt suffocating. Mrs. Gray's face, now pale and anxious, didn't seem to match the calm of the quiet evening outside. Her eyes shifted nervously, flicking back and forth between the pizza and James's hands and the darkened hallway behind her. The faint, scuffling sound that James had heard earlier still echoed in his mind. It was so subtle, like a whisper in a room full of shouting, but now it was gone. The house had gone completely still. the kind of stillness that made his ears ring. "Ma'am," James asked again, his voice soft but firm, "are you sure everything is all right?" Mrs. Gray hesitated, her hand still clutching the doorframe, her knuckles white. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she glanced toward the hallway, her eyes betraying a flicker of fear before she quickly looked back at James, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I'm fine, dear," she said, her voice shaking, the words coming out too quickly. "Really, you should go now." But there was something in her tone, something almost pleading, that made James want to stay. He didn't know why, he barely knew her, but something about the house, about the way she was acting, felt wrong. It wasn't just the odd behavior, it was the silence. It was like the house was holding its breath, like something or someone was waiting in the shadows, watching him. The wind outside had picked up slightly, rustling the trees in the yard. James glanced behind him, as if trying to find an excuse to turn away from the strange scene unfolding before him. But no matter how hard he tried, his feet wouldn't move. His curiosity tugged at him, as strong as a physical force, urging him to step inside, to figure out what was going on. His heart raced, his gut telling him something wasn't right, but his mind couldn't put the pieces together. I can't just leave like this," James said, more to himself than to Mrs. Gray, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is someone in there? Did something happen?" The door creaked ever so slightly, the only sound breaking the heavy silence between them. Mrs. Gray stiffened, her eyes widening, her lips parting in a quick breath. She shook her head violently, her frail hand gesturing for him to leave. "No, no," she whispered harshly, her voice trembling, almost frantic now. "Nothing's wrong. Nothing at all. You need to go now." Her urgency sent a chill down James's spine. He could feel the air thickening, like something unseen was pressing down on him, and he instinctively stepped back. But even as his body moved, his mind was telling him to push further, to look deeper. His instinct screamed that something was wrong, that there was something in the house, something she didn't want him to see. Suddenly, the stillness of the house grew unbearable. James could hear the distant hum of traffic from the main road, but inside the house, it was as though everything had stopped. The faint sounds of the outside world, birds chirping, the occasional car passing seemed distant, muffled. Inside, it was like the house had absorbed all noise, leaving only an oppressive silence that made his skin crawl. And then, just when he thought he might turn away and leave, he heard it again. The dragging sound. It was faint, but unmistakable. A dragging, shuffling noise coming from somewhere deep inside the house. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, like the sound of fabric brushing against the floor or the scrape of something being moved across a wooden surface. But it was enough to make James freeze. His breath caught in his throat. It was coming from the hallway, behind the dark doorway that led deeper into the house. He turned his gaze from Mrs. Gray to the dark hallway behind her. It was too dark to see much, but there, just at the edge of his vision, he thought he saw something move, a shadow shifting against the wall, almost imperceptible, but there nonetheless. The air grew colder, the silence more pronounced. The hairs on the back of James's neck stood up, a prickling sensation running down his spine. He couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was in that house, something that didn't belong. The dragging sound continued, growing slightly louder as if whatever it was moving toward him. "Ma'am, is someone hurt?" James asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He didn't know why he asked. He wasn't a doctor. He wasn't trained to handle emergencies. But the sound, the way Mrs. Gray was acting, it all pointed to something more than just an old woman living alone. Mrs. Gray's face turned ashen, her lips trembling. Her eyes were wide with panic, darting nervously toward the source of the noise. She took a shaky step back, pulling the door tighter around her. "No," she muttered under her breath, her voice hoarse and barely audible. "No, it's nothing. You don't need to worry." But James couldn't shake the feeling that she was lying. He had seen people in distress before. He had dealt with situations that made him uncomfortable. But this was different. There was something in her eyes now, something that made his heart race. The dragging sound stopped abruptly. For a moment, there was only silence, the kind of silence that stretched deep and oppressive, pressing in from all sides. James could feel the weight of it pressing down on him, and for a fleeting moment, he thought about leaving, walking away from the house and never looking back. But then he heard a groan, a faint, strained sound from somewhere in the house. It was a man's voice. The realization hit him like a punch to the stomach. The groan was followed by a low, guttural sound, something that seemed human, but desperate, agonized even. It was the kind of noise that made James's blood run cold. And then, just as quickly as it had started, it stopped. But it wasn't over. James stood there in the middle of the darkened doorway, his pulse thundering in his ears. He wanted to run. He wanted to leave, to get in his car and drive as fast as he could away from this strange, unsettling situation. But his feet felt like they were glued to the floor. His curiosity, his fear, keeping him rooted in place. The silence was deafening now. And then, without warning, Mrs. Gray spoke again, her voice a mere whisper, trembling with fear. "You have to leave. It's too late." The silence in the house was suffocating, so thick it seemed to press against James's chest with every breath. His heart pounded in his ears, each beat louder than the last. He stood there, frozen in the doorway, as Mrs. Gray continued to stare at him, her eyes wide and brimming with panic. For a moment, neither of them moved, as if the house itself was holding its breath. But then, just as James thought the tension could not stretch any further, it came again. That sound, the scraping. It wasn't a whisper now. It was sharper, more distinct, as if something heavy was being dragged slowly across the floor. The noise came from deeper within the house, from beyond the dark hallway that seemed to stretch endlessly into the shadows. The sound echoed in the silence, making James's blood run cold. It was followed by a faint shuffling noise, something that could almost be mistaken for a person dragging themselves along the floor. Scrape, shuffle, scrape, shuffle. It was the kind of sound that made your skin crawl, the kind that made you question whether your own mind was playing tricks on you. But it was too real, too unsettling. James took a step forward, his feet moving almost involuntarily, pulled by the sound, the need to understand what was happening behind that door, beyond the edge of his sight. His hand tightened around the pizza box, as if the flimsy cardboard could somehow offer him protection from the nightmare that was unfolding in front of him. Mrs. Gray, though, seemed to snap out of her trance. She gripped the door tighter, her knuckles white, and in a voice that was barely audible, she whispered, "Please, go now. You don't need to see this. It's not what it seems." Her words barely registered. James could feel his pulse in his throat as the sound grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from the hallway, no longer faint, but clear and undeniable. Scrape, shuffle, scrape. James couldn't stop himself. He had to know what it was, who it was. He moved past Mrs. Gray, ignoring the sharpness in her voice as she pleaded with him to stop, to leave. His eyes were fixed on the dark hallway ahead, the air growing colder with each step. The house seemed to pulse with an unnatural stillness, the kind that made the world outside feel like it didn't exist anymore. Just as he reached the hallway, the noise stopped. For a brief, terrifying moment, there was nothing. No scraping, no shuffling, just silence again. But it wasn't a comforting silence. It was worse than before. It was a silence that felt like it was waiting for something to happen, waiting for James to make the next move. And then, from the depths of the hallway, he heard it, a low groan, a weak, tortured sound that made his stomach twist in horror. It wasn't just a sound. It was a cry, a human cry filled with pain and desperation. It echoed through the house, bouncing off the walls and twisting in James's mind, as if it were calling out to him, begging him to understand, to do something. James's breath caught in his throat. He turned to Mrs. Gray, his voice barely a whisper, hoarse with fear. Who is that?" he asked, his hand trembling as he reached out to the dark hallway. Mrs. Gray's face crumpled, and for the first time, tears welled up in her eyes. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. Her lips quivered, and she shook her head slowly, as if trying to deny the truth, trying to block it from both her mind and James's. And then, just as he was about to take another step forward, the groaning stopped, replaced by something far worse. A loud, sickening thud echoed through the hallway. James stood there in the hallway, the sound of the groan still reverberating in his ears. His chest was tight, every instinct screaming at him to run, to get away from the house as fast as possible. But his feet remained rooted to the spot. That thud, that sickening, heavy sound that had followed the groan, it had done something to him. It ignited a sense of urgency, a forceful pull deep inside him that overpowered his fear. He had to know what was happening. Mrs. Gray's tears were streaming down her face now, her hands trembling as she clutched the door frame with all her remaining strength. She didn't say a word, her lips barely moving, but her eyes spoke volumes: fear, regret, guilt, and perhaps, just beneath it all, a hint of pleading. She was begging him, silently, to leave it alone, to walk away. But James couldn't. He couldn't walk away from this. His mind raced. 1,000 thoughts bombarded him all at once. None of them made sense, but they all led him in one direction, deeper into the house. It wasn't just about curiosity anymore, it was something darker, something pulling at his very core. A part of him was terrified, but another part, the part that had always sought answers, urged him to take that next step. He turned to Mrs. Gray, his voice hoarse but steady. "I'm sorry," he said, his words soft but filled with determination. "But I can't leave. I have to see what's happening here. I need to know." Her gaze dropped to the floor, and her shoulders sagged in resignation, as if she had given up on trying to stop him. It was clear she was afraid of what James might discover, or perhaps of what had already been discovered. James swallowed hard, trying to steady his breath. He glanced down the dark hallway again, the shadows pooling in the corners, stretching like fingers reaching out to pull him in. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, but the groaning sound, the thud, it had been too real, too human. The thought that someone might be in pain, in need of help, cut through his fear like a blade. He stepped forward, inching closer to the heart of the house, his footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. With each movement, the air around him grew colder, heavier. It felt oppressive, like the walls were closing in, like the house itself was alive, watching him. As he walked deeper into the hallway, the faint smell of something stale and musty hung in the air. The groaning had stopped, but the silence that followed was just as suffocating. James tried to steady his breathing, but his chest was tight, his throat dry. He wasn't sure what he was expecting to find, but a part of him was already preparing for something he couldn't fully comprehend. And then, just as he reached the first room on the left, he heard it again. Not the groan, not the dragging sound. This time it was different. A faint rustling, like something was moving in the dark, shifting and turning as if trying to find a way out. The noise was coming from the room at the end of the hallway, and for a brief moment it was like time itself had stopped. His heart raced in his chest as he moved closer, unable to turn away, even as his legs trembled beneath him. James reached for the door handle. His hand shook, but he gripped it anyway, turning it slowly, the sound of the latch clicking in the stillness. The door creaked open, revealing a room swallowed by darkness. His eyes strained to adjust, but there was nothing. Nothing except shadows that seemed to twist unnaturally against the walls. But then he saw it. A figure, barely visible in the dim light. A person hunched on the floor, their back to him, their hands moving frantically as though they were searching for something or someone. James's breath caught in his throat. The air was thick with dread, but he couldn't stop himself now. He had to know. He had to see what was behind the door. Who's in there? James asked, his voice barely a whisper. His mind raced, but his feet were frozen. The figure didn't answer, but the rustling continued, growing louder. And then, in that moment, the figure turned slowly, its face half shrouded in shadow, a twisted grin spreading across its lips. James felt the ground slip out from under him. This wasn't what he had expected, what he had hoped for. It was something far worse. James's breath caught in his throat as the figure turned to face him. The dim light from the hallway illuminated just enough of the room for him to see the twisted shape of the person before him. But it wasn't just the figure itself that sent a cold shiver down his spine. It was the look in its eyes, cold, empty, hollow, as if the very soul of the person had been drained, leaving behind only an eerie shell. The figure's grin was unnatural, stretching too wide as though it belonged to someone who hadn't smiled in years, or perhaps never at all. For a moment, James stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move, unable to speak. His heart pounded in his chest and every instinct screamed for him to turn and flee, but his body refused to obey. The room was too silent, the atmosphere too heavy with tension. Then the figure spoke. A low, guttural voice filled the room, its tone twisted and labored. "You shouldn't have come." James's blood ran cold. The words were barely above a whisper, but they cut through him like ice. He opened his mouth to respond, but no sound came out. His body was paralyzed, his mind racing, trying to process what he was seeing. The figure slowly, painfully stood up. Its movements were stiff, unnatural, as though its joints were stiffened by years of neglect or torment. As it rose, the shadows seemed to move with it, like the darkness was alive, clinging to its form. And then, as the figure took a step forward, the faintest glint of light caught something at its feet. Something small, something metallic. James blinked, trying to make sense of it, but the object was too far for him to identify. He took a hesitant step closer, driven by something he couldn't explain. His mind screamed at him to retreat, to get out, but the need to understand, To find out what was happening here was too overwhelming. The figure suddenly collapsed to the ground, its movements jerky, its face contorting in pain. James flinched, unsure of what to do. Was it hurt? Was it trying to warn him? But before he could make a decision, the figure let out a raspy, choking breath. It wasn't a cry of pain, though. It was a laugh, a deep, hollow laugh that echoed through the room like a death rattle. "Not what you thought, is it?" the figure croaked, lifting its head to reveal a face twisted in agony. James took a cautious step closer, his eyes wide with disbelief. That face, it looked familiar, too familiar. He recognized the frail features, the hollow cheeks, the sunken eyes. It was Mrs. Gray. But it wasn't her, not entirely. Her face was distorted, and her skin was pale, stretched tight over bone. Her once gentle features now seemed to belong to something unrecognizable, something unnatural. As she turned her head to meet his gaze, James saw the truth behind the horror in her eyes. It was as if she had been living in this place, in this house, for so long that it had eaten away at her. The last shred of humanity was gone, replaced by something dark, something unnatural. What are you?" James whispered, stepping back instinctively, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was witnessing. Mrs. Gray's twisted grin remained, but there was something else in her eyes now. Regret, maybe, or perhaps a recognition of the horror she had become. "I didn't want this. I didn't ask for it. But it's too late now," she said, her voice rasping and full of despair. As James stumbled backward, the full scope of the horror began to sink in. The figure on the floor, Mrs. Gray, wasn't alone. Behind her, hidden in the shadows, James saw other shapes, other figures, hunched and broken, their eyes lifeless. They were all trapped in the same nightmare, victims of the same darkness that had consumed Mrs. Gray. Each one had once been a person, an individual, before something twisted them, turned them into these lifeless husks. The sound, the scraping, the shuffling, it was all a sign of their torment. James could feel the weight of the room pressing in on him. He turned to run, but as his hand touched the door frame, a voice, louder now, more insistent, stopped him. "You can't leave," it said. James whirled around, his heart racing, but it was too late. The darkness had already begun to close in. James's breath hitched as the shadowy figures around Mrs. Gray began to shift, their eyes following his every movement with a kind of hollow longing. He could feel the room growing colder, the walls closing in, as if the house itself were feeding on the tension, feeding on the fear. The silence was crushing, broken only by the low rustling sounds from the dark figures in the corner. But then, as he backed away, Mrs. Gray's voice pierced the stillness, sharp and clear. "It's not what you think," she said, her voice suddenly steady, her eyes locking onto his with a strange intensity. The twisted grin on her face faded slightly, replaced by something closer to remorse, or perhaps guilt. James froze. There was something in her voice, a shift, as though the woman he had seen earlier, the fearful, pleading woman, was no longer there. Instead, standing before him was someone far more dangerous, far more calculating. Her eyes burned with a truth she had been hiding for far too long. "I never meant for this to happen. I didn't want it to spiral so far out of control," she continued, her voice shaking now, but not with fear. It was as if she were struggling to tell a story she had tried to bury for years, but couldn't any longer. James didn't know whether to feel pity or terror. His hand hovered near the door, ready to flee, but something in her tone rooted him in place. This woman, this creature, was telling him something that he wasn't ready to hear. Mrs. Gray's hands shook as she wiped away the tears that had been streaming down her face. It all started with a mistake, a deal I should have never made. I thought I could control it. I thought I could use it for good. But I was wrong. She took a shallow breath, and her voice became almost a whisper. I made a pact with something old, something ancient, a power that promised to cure the loneliness that plagued me, to bring me the company I craved, the company of those I lost. James's mind was spinning. Was this some sort of sick joke? A mental breakdown? He stared at Mrs. Gray, her face now completely transformed. No longer the frail old woman he had delivered pizza to, but a figure twisted by the weight of her own secrets. I didn't know what it would cost, she continued, her eyes darkening. I didn't know the price of what I was calling into this house, but when it came, when the darkness found me, it brought others with it. Others who were lost, like me. I didn't know how to stop it. I couldn't stop it. James took an instinctive step backward, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. What are you saying? What happened to them? His voice was shaking now, betraying the fear that was starting to build in his chest. Mrs. Gray looked down, her face contorted with sorrow and something darker. Regret, maybe. But as she lifted her gaze to meet his, there was something else in her eyes, a twisted sort of relief, like she had been waiting for this moment for far too long. They're not people anymore, she whispered. They were once my friends, my family. But the pact, it transformed them. It took their souls, their essence, and twisted them into something else. And the worst part? I'm still here, alive, suspended in time. I should have died with them, but I couldn't let go. I couldn't leave. James's heart hammered in his chest. You did this? He asked, his voice barely audible. Mrs. Gray nodded slowly, her eyes glazed. I didn't know, I swear. I thought it would be different. But when the darkness took them, when it took my friends and family, they became shadows, trapped here, waiting, just like me, waiting for someone to come, someone to break the curse. Her gaze grew desperate, her voice trembling with the weight of her confession. And now, it's your turn, James. You shouldn't have come. You should have stayed away. But now you're part of it, whether you like it or not. The room seemed to close in around him as the shadows behind her stirred, the figures creeping forward, their eyes locked on him with the same hollow hunger he had seen in Mrs. Gray. But now, there was something different in their movement. Purpose. You're going to join us, Mrs. Gray murmured. Her voice was distant now, almost echoing, as though she were fading into the darkness herself. And in that moment, James felt the cold air press down on him, as if the house were swallowing him whole. It was the ultimate twist, the one he hadn't seen coming. Mrs. Gray had lured him here, not by mistake but by design. She had used him to complete a cycle, to bring him into the fold of shadows, to become part of the very darkness she had been trapped in. She had known. All along, she had known. And now, James realized with sickening clarity, there was no escape. The door slammed shut behind him, the last shred of light disappearing into the suffocating blackness. And, in that moment, James understood the terrible truth. There was no way out. The door slammed shut behind James with a deafening finality, the sound reverberating through the house like the closing of a tomb. The darkness that enveloped him seemed to thicken, growing heavier with each passing second. His heart pounded violently against his ribs as he turned, eyes wide in terror. The figures in the room were closing in, their movements slow but deliberate, their eyes hollow and vacant, yet filled with a sinister intent. The weight of Mrs. Gray's words, "You're going to join us," echoed in his mind like a death knell. He stumbled backward, his breath ragged, his thoughts racing. No, this isn't real. It can't be real. But the figures were moving, inching closer, their eyes locked onto him with a hunger he couldn't escape. "Please," James whispered, his voice trembling, "I don't want to be part of this. I just want to leave. Let me go." But they didn't answer. They didn't need to. Their silent pursuit spoke volumes. James's eyes darted around the room, searching for an escape. The shadows seemed to stretch, distorting the space, closing in from all sides. The windows were blacked out, the curtains drawn tight. The only way out was through the door, but that door was now a barrier, sealed shut by something far darker than wood and nails. His throat constricted as panic set in, his mind racing for any way to break free, to find a way out of this nightmare. But then Mrs. Gray's voice, a low, almost affectionate murmur, stopped him cold. "You can't escape, James. Not anymore. The curse, it's already started." James's blood ran cold as the weight of her words sank in. His mind was spinning. The curse. What did that mean? He turned to face her, his eyes filled with desperation. The woman, if she could still even be called that, was no longer standing. She was now on the floor, her limbs contorted in unnatural angles, her body slowly sinking into the darkness like it was being absorbed by the very ground beneath her. "Please," James begged again, his voice cracking, "what do I have to do to stop this?" Mrs. Gray's lips curled into a twisted smile, and for a moment, just a moment, he could almost see the woman she had once been, the kind, fragile soul who had placed the order. But that woman was long gone, replaced by something darker, something insidious. "You're already part of it, James. Don't you see?" she whispered. "There's no escape from the darkness now. You've crossed over, and it won't let you go." As her words sank in, a new sound filled the room, a low, unnatural hum, rising like a chorus of voices, faint but growing louder, filling the air with a sense of impending doom. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to pulse with life, undulating like they were breathing, like the house itself was alive, feeding off the fear, the tension. James could feel the floor beneath him tremble. The figures began to move toward him once more, and though his body screamed to run, his feet remained rooted in place. His vision blurred, and his mind felt like it was unraveling. What now? What can I do? Then, just as it seemed the shadows were about to consume him, a loud crash echoed through the house. The front door, still locked, was suddenly flung open, and a beam of bright light flooded the room, cutting through the darkness like a sword. The figures recoiled, hissing, their bodies writhing as the light pierced the shadows. Through the doorway, a figure stepped into the room. A man, tall and strong, his features shadowed but his presence undeniable. James could barely see him through the haze of panic, but there was no mistaking the aura of power that emanated from him. The man stepped forward, his voice commanding, cutting through the air like thunder. "Leave him alone," the man ordered, his voice strong and clear. The shadows recoiled even further, hissing in pain as though the light was burning them. The figure reached out a hand, and a pulse of energy radiated from him, blasting through the room with a force that sent the figures scattering into the corners, their forms flickering and fading as though they were being undone. Mrs. Gray's form shrieked, her body contorting in unnatural angles as the light from the man's presence grew brighter, consuming her. The figures, no longer human, no longer a threat, faded into the darkness, their presence dissolved by the light. James stood frozen, unable to move, unable to speak, as the man approached him. The man looked at James, his eyes piercing but full of understanding. "You're safe now," he said, his voice softening, "but the darkness is far from gone. You need to leave. Now." James nodded, his mind still reeling, but the sheer presence of the man was enough to snap him out of his terror. He took a shaky step toward the doorway, glancing one last time at the room, at the fading shadows. What had just happened? What had he seen? As James stepped out into the light, the man's voice echoed behind him, a final warning. "Don't ever come back." And as James turned, the door slammed shut behind him, sealing the house once more in darkness. But somewhere deep inside him, a question lingered. Was it really over? The darkness had been driven back, for now, but it wasn't gone, and that truth, like the shadows in that house, would forever haunt him. What now? What lies beyond the door? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and if you want to find out what happens next, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to the channel. You won't want to miss what's coming up next.